Welcome to another Psychedelic Today podcast with David Drapkin, in conversation with Hans Eriksson, the Chief Clinical Development Officer from HMNC Brain Health. Lovely to see you, Hans. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think I wanted to start with, you've got tons of experience in drug development, big pharma, and now in psychedelic medicine. I'd like to start with you talking about psychiatry and what brought you into psychiatry, kind of what was the motivation and what was the world of psychiatry like when you did enter that field?
Yeah, I mean, psychiatry is really fascinating. I mean, it's something that touches so many people and it becomes part of so many people's lives because challenges to mental health are very common, and most people, if they haven't suffered from some mental disorder themselves, they typically have friends or relatives who have gone through mental disorders. So it's something that really affects us all. I was really fascinated by the understanding that on one level, this extremely complex system of the human brain, probably the most complex system in the known universe, can find some of the explanations regarding its functioning in chemicals, in compounds of different sorts interacting with targets, receptors, transporters, etc. And that this can have a profound effect on how we feel and think. And this link between, on one hand, basic biology, and on the other hand, this complex emotional world that is being a human is so fascinating.
Mm. And what was it like, if you don't mind saying, the years that you were entering the profession, what was it like then? And maybe how has psychiatry evolved since then?
It has evolved quite a lot. I mean, I started working in psychiatry in the early and mid 80s, and that was a time in Europe, at least, when the ideas of a much more scientific diagnostic system was gaining space there as well. I think the DSM system from the American Psychiatric Association, you can have many views about it, but it gave more structure to psychiatric diagnosis. So I think I started working in psychiatry where we became a bit better in understanding the differences between people with different types of mental disorders. And I also joined psychiatry at a point in time where two big groups of medicines were started being phased out. I'm thinking about the old tricyclic antidepressants, which were to a large extent the foundation of pharmacological treatment, and also the more conventional the more conventional antipsychotics were also to some extent being phased out in favor of, on the depression side, the SSRIs, and later on the SNRIs, which were drugs that had similar efficacy as the tricyclics but better safety. And on the antipsychotic side, the atypicals, which perhaps didn't carry the promise of superior efficacy, but at least in some respects better tolerability. So it was a period when there was lots of change to psychiatry, and all this happened against the backdrop of the closing down of the old mental hospitals.
Mm. And the influx of patients into normal life, and it might be supportive housing, but not so much kind of inpatient, staying there for long periods of time.
Yeah, yes, has been a huge change.
Mm. Are you saying that the developments around the medications enabled that, at least partially, to happen?
I would say no, to be quite honest. It would have been nice to say that all of this was because of medical developments. I think it was more politically and driven and by a wish in the society to have less of a divide between people who are unfortunate enough to have a mental disorder and the rest, because there is no such clear divide, and also the realization that lots of people actually benefit from being much more actively part of the society. I also recognize that everyone who was treated in the old type of psychiatry with the mental hospitals has not benefited from the hospitals being closed. So it has been a very difficult path to follow and to balance on. But I would say in general, I think it has been good to make psychiatry come out of the big mental hospitals and more into society care.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with the experiences from England, where I grew up, in America where I live now, around the movement of patients into the community and out of inpatient settings, generally speaking. I'm curious as to the Scandinavian model, kind of ideologically, ethically. What's the sense there, just more broadly, about mental health, about psychiatry, wellness, and community support?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the situation has been quite similar in the Scandinavian countries. When I started working, I was working in a very large traditional psychiatric hospital with building after building after building in a beautiful lush park landscape, but still with inpatients. I think in general, the society has accepted the fact that there must be better ways of helping people coming through their mental disorders. At the same time, I think we in Scandinavia as elsewhere also have seen the consequences of some people being left too much alone, giving the ground for homelessness and things like that. So it has been a difficult balance to strike. But in general, I think we saw a very similar trend in Scandinavia as was seen in the rest of Europe and in the United States as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think that the ability of medications is quite limited to cure depression. And that's why this social model is beneficial. But also, when we think about psychedelic assisted therapy, the assisted therapy piece is really key. And I wanted to talk to you about Compass Pathways phase 2 data, because there's a lot of people discussing that. But before we jump into those things, and I wanted to just say, once you finish psychiatry, you left school, off to work you go. What happened next? Kind of just paint a picture between that point in your life and when you then came to HMNC within the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I started out by working as a consultant psychiatrist in Sweden. I was also in a leadership role where I was the assistant head of a very large psychiatric hospital clinic. I liked it a lot, but I also since many years had been very fascinated by how you can overcome the problems by applying more of biological interventions. So when I was approached by a pharmaceutical company in Denmark, I thought that was something I really would like to try on. So I left from full-time clinical work to largely full-time drug development work about 22 years ago. I've been working in a couple of different companies, small and large, and I've been involved in several development programs of what I see as important medications. So in that respect, I've also felt that I've been able to still see to the needs of patients, even though it has been from a more distant point.
Yeah. And do you see any patients at the moment, or is it more, kind of behind the scenes doing the science?
Currently, I do not see patients, but there was a period a couple of years ago between two jobs when I was working for 4 or 5 months as a consultant psychiatry, where I decided to work with emergency psychiatry, meeting people in essentially in the emergency ward, and be able to provide immediate support, initial diagnostic assessments, and initial treatment. Which I think is a very crucial point for many people with a mental disorder, especially if they have never been in contact with healthcare for their problems previously, to provide as good a start as possible, and also to provide that reassurance that for most people there is actually a path through at least the worst suffering, and in many instances a road back to normal life.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Um, and your time at AstraZeneca, you were there for 8+ years, I think, medical science director.
Yes.
That's a massive, massive company. So $26 billion revenue in 2020. What's
Yeah.
it like working for such a big company like that?
First of all, I think I had very good experience at AstraZeneca. I think it was a very good company to work for, very dedicated to do the right things and do things the right way. Um, the advantage of working in a large organization like that is that some things run as clockwork. There are routines and processes and procedures for everything. So it's a very efficient machinery. And I think the challenge, which I think they managed to live up to quite well, is to not lose the creativity and the originality. So it's a balancing act, because the efficient machinery makes drug development easier, but also the need to be space to react to the unexpected finding and think about, oh, maybe that's something we could try to use to further enhance the projects we are working with.
Yeah. And when you worked at Compass Pathways, Hans, what was your experience there just before you joined them? Because that was your first kind of dally in the psychedelic
Yeah.
psychiatry world. So what was going through your mind at that time? You know, I guess you were launching, and what was the reasons, or what interested you particularly about coming into the psychedelic
I
medicine
mean,
world?
I think there were two things. One was the scientific understanding that the development in the psychedelic space has the potential to really transform psychiatry. So that was something that was very attractive to me, but also a feeling that now I've spent close to 20 years working in these big, well-oiled pharmaceutical companies where everyone has a role, he performs it well, and it's the consolidated output that makes a difference. But I wanted to get an experience from working in a smaller company where the tasks are less clearly defined, where it's more hands-on work, and we need to really work together as a small team and overcome the challenges of being a small organization.
Yeah, yeah, and you were chief medical officer there as well. What's your interpretations of Compass's phase 2 results for their, Comp 360
Yeah,
for major depressive disorder? Because that's obviously the field that you're still working in, depressive
yeah.
disorders.
Yes, I mean I can't make too many comments on results from a company where I'm no longer working, but I must say that I was very pleased when I saw the results. There seems to be a clear signal that there is efficacy in a psychedelic compound. So I think they did an excellent job in delivering that study, and to some extent it was the evidence that the psychedelic approach in general is really worth pursuing.
Hmm. Yeah, and the proof of concept, it really sends a big message because there's no other, or not many other phase 2 results that are out other than maps for MDMA. And yeah, my takeaway from that, Hans, was it spoke to perhaps the need to have more psychedelic dosing medicine sessions than the ones they had in their protocol, and also it reflected the importance of the psychotherapy piece,
Yeah,
having that really built around the entire kind of journey of the person
yeah,
going through the psilocybin experience, which is kind of what we were talking about before. Another piece of research that I don't think you were involved with was at Imperial College. Now, you
yeah,
mentioned that in the past you were involved with Escitalopram,
yeah.
and then there was that study last year where Robin Carhart-Harris et al.
Yes,
And the crew from Imperial College were comparing escitalopram to psilocybin.
yeah.
So I'd be fascinated to hear what's your understanding of how they can compare and contrast to each other. That standard SSRI compared to psychedelic medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think escitalopram is a good representative of what we could call um, standard treatment today. It's a well researched and widely used SSRI medication, often among the first line treatments used in psychiatry worldwide. And I think it's a good representative of sort of the traditional school of medicine. So I think it was a good choice as a comparator. From a pure drug development perspective, there is always the challenge that when you're working with medicines that have profound effects that are detectable to the individuals who take the medicines, there is always a challenge to blind the study because there is a high risk that there is an unintentional unblinding. But nevertheless, I really think that their data show that also here that psychedelic medicine has a potential to stand out as something that, at least in many patients, could offer advantages beyond what the traditional medicines bring today.
Yeah, any sense about what those additional advantages look like from the psilocybin side for the study?
I mean, if we talk in general about psychedelics, I mean, there is this debate about the importance of the experience. Is it absolutely necessary, or is it just an epiphenomenon? I think with time we will learn about this. I don't think anyone can really tell today, but I met so many people who have experienced profound benefits with psychedelics, which they, to a large extent, assign to the psychological experience. So I think it is important. So I think we're opening up to a new type of intervention that is not only relying upon the biological interaction of a molecule with its target, but also what happens in our brains when this happens. It also puts perhaps a bit more emphasis on the context in which the medication gets administered. And personally, I believe that for psilocybin, for instance, I do believe that the psychotherapeutic component adds value. Whether it adds all of the value or whether it adds 10% of the value, I cannot tell. But I think it's very reasonable to start out in this way, and time will tell where most of the efficacy lies.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're just at the beginning. It's incredible, isn't it, that
Yeah.
even though psychiatry and psychotherapy, psychoanalysis is, centuries old, we are at the cutting edge. And I know we're going to talk about some of the work that you're doing at HMNC. I want to first, let's talk about the brain. So
Yeah.
your company is actually called HMNC Brain Health.
Yes.
And you said just earlier, Hans, that you actually believe that the brain is the most complicated, complex entity in the entire universe. So I love that. And I honestly, I feel a similar way. Just the concept of consciousness. We don't really even know how our brain works. I think it's so complex. So talk to me, speak a poem about the brain, if you wish. What's your relationship with the brain? How do you see it and sense its role and its functioning and dysfunctioning?
I mean, on one hand, I see it as this fascinating myriad of connections where we are just starting to get an understanding. At the same time, I've also seen how in certain really profound brain disorders, relatively simple interventions can make a huge difference. If for instance, take persons who have psychotic disorders with delusions or hallucinations, the idea of blocking dopamine D2 receptors does a lot in terms of decreasing that really out of the ordinary experience that is so handicapping to many people. So while on one hand, I really appreciate the enormous complexity, it's also a bit surprising that in some instances, it seems as if really profound disturbances can be affected by simple interventions. But at the same time, we can take another example. We know the pathology involved in Alzheimer's disease quite well, with all the changes that occurs to the brain that are visible under a microscope if you look at a piece of brain tissue. And even though there have been so many attempts to address that disturbance, that has so far not been successful, broadly speaking. So I think it's wise to have a very humble attitude to the brain, and I certainly don't believe that there will be any quick fixes, because we can take as an example again schizophrenia with delusions and hallucinations. Yes, it's often quite feasible to overcome them by a specific targeted drug, but that is not enough to cure and help individuals with schizophrenia cope with all their problems. There are other areas of symptoms and dysfunctions in people with schizophrenia that are not at all addressed by these D2 blockers. So I think it's wise to be humble, and I don't think we will ever find the panacea that will treat everything. Sometimes I can sense that within the psychedelic space there is a tendency towards this. I think we can achieve lots with psychedelics, but I think that for the foreseeable future we will have to continue working with a really rich toolbox with perhaps the traditional medicines, with the novel psychological treatments like the dissociative compounds, like the psychedelic compounds, and also with more refined ways of providing psychotherapeutic interventions.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great segue to now talk about HMNC. In a nutshell, can you tell everybody what company are we talking about here? What's your kind of main focuses, maybe the pipeline that you're developing, where you're located? Just paint a wee picture, please.
Yeah. So we are a company based in Munich in southern Germany, just north of the Alps. It was founded by a legendary expert on how depression is linked to disturbances in the human stress response system. Professor Florian Holzboer, he formerly held a very senior leadership role at the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry in Munich. So he brought lots of his interest in working on the link between stress response system dysfunction and depression to the company. So that was very core when the company was developing. And over the years, we have been able to link those functions around compounds we have access to predictive diagnostic tests that can tell who will respond to a specific intervention that may overcome a disturbance in the stress response system. So that is one very important thread to find better treatments for those people with depression who seem to have a malfunction in the stress response system, which is not all depressed individuals. It's about a third, roughly speaking, that have this disturbance. But there are tools to overcome those disturbances, and we have also developed the tools and also based on work at the Max Planck Institute in Munich to identify those individuals. So one part of what we are doing is precision psychiatry, to look at individuals and test them and see whether they are more likely to respond to a certain intervention. So that is something that is really novel in psychiatry. I used to say the example that if someone comes into the hospital after a car accident and needs a blood transfusion, no one would ever think the thought that we take any blood we have in the storage. They would check what blood group you have. That's so normal. But still in psychiatry, when someone comes in with a severe depression, we hand out an SSRI, typically as a first-line treatment. But think if you could have a tool that could say, okay, but you belong to the 30% that has a very good likelihood of responding very well to a medicine that corrects your stress response system. That could lead to much shorter path from the interaction with the healthcare to actually overcoming the depression. And also the 2/3 that are less likely to respond to this treatment perhaps even shouldn't try it and have false hopes associated with it. So that's one very important path of what we are doing, bringing precision psychiatry alive. But we're also very interested in these compounds that are part of the novel treatment paradigm. We are very interested in ketamine. And ketamine, as you know, has been around for many years, first as an anesthetic agent, and for the last decade and a half, something like that, with lots of interest directed towards its use as an antidepressant at lower doses. And here we think we can provide additional value, because there is no doubt that ketamine is antidepressant. It has been given intravenously to show antidepressant efficacy. There is one compound with the S enantiomer of ketamine approved as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. So we know that it works, and it works robustly with an early onset of effect. Unfortunately, it for many patients comes with dissociative experiences, which are psychological highs that many people experience as unpleasant. It also comes with a transient blood pressure increase. So that has, for instance, if you look at in the United States, the FDA has mandated that when the nasal spray of esketamine is administered, that has to be under physician supervision to check for dissociative side effects and to follow the patients for several hours and to measure blood pressure, etc. So that unfortunately has practically limited the use of ketamine. So our hypothesis, which I think is starting to gather more and more evidence, is that if we could administer ketamine in a different way, it might still be possible to get the good efficacy that we have seen with other formulations, but to avoid the dissociative side effects. So in a way, you could say that we are trying to develop a dissociative compound for depression. And the way we believe that this can be achieved is that we give ketamine not intranasally, not intravenously, but orally. And we give it orally in a slow release formulations. You swallow the pill, and slowly, the concentration builds up in the body. And we believe that the slow concentration buildup may contribute to the good tolerability of our compound, but also the fact that if you take ketamine orally, everything is picked up in the gut and transported to the liver. And in the liver, much of the parent compound, ketamine, is metabolized. So the contribution by the parent compound, ketamine, is less when you take it orally compared to if you give it, let's say, intranasally. And we, on the other hand, have more of metabolites that are formed later on that are also active. So we have seen with our compound that there is virtually no dissociation. And we had the readout from a small proof of concept study with less than 30 patients in Switzerland at an academic site, an investigator-initiated study a month and a half ago. And there we saw that, the study was very small, but the efficacy in terms of the degree of improvement on a standard rating scale was really substantial. And that improvement appeared to come without dissociation and without blood pressure changes. So it seems as if we're now starting to move on that path of getting the benefits of ketamine and potentially other drugs with a similar mechanism of action without getting the side effects that have practically become quite problematic. So it's very nice that last week we included the first patients in our larger phase 2 study in Europe, where we are going to explore adjunctive or add-on ketamine for treatment-resistant depression.
So many questions. That's great.
Good.
Thank you. So where do we start? I think just to feed back to you what I'm hearing, Hans. So this ketamine that you're using is oral, it's prolonged release, and it doesn't sound like it's coming with psychotherapy attached. Or at least in the pilot studies you've done so far, it's more just proof of concept. It's tolerated, has efficacy. Does this need psychotherapy alongside it? And where would a patient be when they have this? Can they do it at home, for example?
Yeah. So we don't believe that psychotherapy is necessary. It may for ketamine. I'm not talking about the traditional psychedelics now. We don't think it is necessary. We cannot tell whether psychotherapy would add additional value. That may very well be the case. But it seems as if it is indeed possible to get efficacy without this burden of side effects. And the phase 2 study we are starting in Europe in 3 countries right now, there we are going to administer oral ketamine at home. The first dose will be given under physician supervision, but we're expecting that we will get no dissociative side effects, and if that doesn't happen, the patients will continue dosing for 3 weeks, a daily dose taken at home.
So that's huge, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're doing it at home from accessibility. So you're going to enter into phase 2 on this study. Do you have any sense of how many patients you're going to be bringing into those clinical sites to kind of prove the concept out?
Yes. So I mean,
just talk us through that study.
Yeah. So the study is a relatively traditional phase 2 study with close to 40 patients per treatment arm. So we are testing 2 doses of ketamine versus placebo as an add-on treatment on top of a standard antidepressant. And the patients need to qualify as having treatment-resistant depression. So those are the persons who have tried and not been able to come out of their depression. So they have to have failed on 2 prior treatment attempts with antidepressants, and they're going to take the medicine at home, and we will follow them closely with visits with short intervals during this period, and the expectation is that we have, based on the first smaller proof of concept study, the expectation is that we have a good likelihood of detecting any signals of efficacy, and also we have of course included lots of assessments of potential side effects, so we can clearly document that there is a difference in those traditional ketamine side effects when given like this.
Is there any discussion around creating another arm that has the ketamine without the SSRI?
Yes, there has been such a discussion, but we, first of all, when you're when you're developing a drug, you typically select a setting in which you're going to give the drug, and we have decided to use ketamine as an add-on adjunctive treatment on top of a standard antidepressant. And we could certainly have added one arm without the underlying antidepressant. That would have complicated the study quite a lot and probably not have been really advisable from a regulatory perspective. But I understand where you're coming from, and I personally believe that ketamine is probably efficacious also without an antidepressant. So that's certainly something that would be of interest to explore. And looking into the future, who knows where ketamine will be used? Right now, it's limited mainly to treatment-resistant depression. But if you can find a safe and convenient way to administer it, there may be room for giving it at an earlier treatment stage in depression. But I want to be very clear on that we are developing it as a treatment-resistant depression treatment. And before using it in a broader MDD population, I think any responsible drug developer needs to make sure that the appropriate clinical trials are conducted to document that efficacy.
Yeah, it will be very powerful data, once you get to the end of phase 2, because you're saying that these people that are on SSRIs, what's the difference that the ketamine makes? And we know that SSRIs, if someone has treatment-resistant major depressive disorder, they've tried at least 2 in that kind of sequence of depression. So adding in the ketamine, it will be really interesting to see, the difference that it makes. So Hans, this might be a very easy question to answer briefly. About SSRIs and kind of tapering off them. So I know a lot of people personally that have really struggled with that process of getting off SSRIs, and it can make depression worse, or kind of suicidal ideations and kind of physical, gut experiences. So I'm wondering, this is very kind of hypothetical, but I wonder if ketamine could even help in the longer term, once we have more data, to be that kind of adjunctive bridging prescription to help people get off SSRIs.
I think that's completely possible, and I agree with you that many people stopping SSRIs have these unpleasant experiences, and the way clinicians traditionally help people to cope with that has been to have a very, very slow discontinuation of the treatment. And if you have been on an SSRI for, let's say, 9 to 12 months for depression and you're feeling okay, then there is no real hurry in terminating the treatment. So you can do that over 2-3 months. And that is one approach that minimizes the risk of these discontinuation effects. But you could also argue here for ketamine in treatment-resistant depression. Why on earth continue with the medicine that doesn't work?
That's what I was thinking and getting at.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting. And I want to just get a bit of clarification. You've mentioned a few times this stress response system and kind of stress hormones.
Yeah.
Can you educate me for free, please? What are we talking about here, and how does that kind of fit in with your model?
Okay. So we as humans, we have the ability to produce a stress hormone called cortisol, which is a human stress hormone. It's produced by small glands called the adrenals, tiny glands sitting close to the kidneys. So that's the manufacturing place. But nature has determined that it's better not to leave them on their own. They need to be guided, and they need to be guided from the brain. So the brain has an ability to regulate the release of cortisol, from production and release of cortisol from the adrenals. So it starts at higher centers in the brain, and there are hormones like vasopressin and corticotropin releasing hormone that are involved in conveying the signal. From the pituitary, which is a small gland in the middle of our heads, there is then another signal with another hormone called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, that drives the adrenals to produce cortisol. So that's the brain's way of making sure that the cells in the adrenals are doing their job. And in healthy individuals, this system is under delicate control. So when the system becomes hyperactive, there are feedback mechanisms that calms down the system again. But in a significant proportion of depressed individuals, this system seems to be in a hyperactive state, resulting in higher cortisol production. And above all, the system cannot be inhibited. Therefore, for a long time, pharma has has looked at this system, and they have tried inhibitors of both vasopressin and corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, and that are working higher up in this stress axis, or HPA axis, which means hypothalamus pituitary adrenals axis. So more than 10 years ago, a large pharmaceutical company had one compound called nalivaptan, which we have in our portfolio right now, in development for the treatment of depression. Interestingly, in one of the large phase 2 studies they conducted with patients, they actually met the primary endpoint and saw a signal of antidepressant efficacy. So it seems as if the drug works, but the efficacy was on par with that of a standard antidepressant. There was no superior efficacy. And they didn't progress the program. So it's in our hands now for development, this compound. But we believe that the efficacy that was seen in this large study probably was driven by a subset of individuals who have a disturbance in the vasopressin system, have too high central vasopressin function. So our expectation is that when we apply our genetic test that identifies these individuals, we have the ability to achieve really good efficacy outcomes in these patients, and the ones not detected by the test should probably try something else.
So let's talk about the test that you're using now. But I first just want to make the point that, as amazing as you and me were both saying the brain is, we're also saying, I think, that psychiatry needs to kind of get outside of the brain, look at the other systems within the body. And you're talking about,
Yep.
the adrenal glands, pituitary gland,
Yep.
other organs in the
Absolutely.
body. It's not just brain centric. And maybe
No,
that's
no,
one of the
no,
things we need to understand about mental health as well. It's not just about the brain.
no. I completely agree. So, talk a little about our test. It has quite an interesting history, because historically it has been known for decades that it is possible to test for hyperactivity in this HPA axis. And to do so, a challenge test is conducted. It's relatively complicated. If you're going to undergo the test, you typically need to be hospitalized for a couple of days. First getting a synthetic steroid called dexamethasone, and then you're getting this hormone CRH I was talking about. And then blood is drawn at several different time points. I think in the original method, 17 different blood draws are made, and then the concentrations of, among others, the hormone ACTH is calculated, and depending on the overall result, it's possible to classify individuals as being non-suppressors, unable to suppress the hyperactive HPA axis, or having a normal function. So the good news is that it's indeed possible to find these individuals. The not so good news is that it's so complex that this method has never really been absorbed in clinical practice. And therefore, the team over at Max Planck several years ago did a monumental task. They conducted this test in a large group of depressed individuals, and as expected, they were able to find about a third of these individuals as being non-suppressors, the persons who have indications of central vasopressin hyperactivity. The clever step they did that after that was they were able to map the outcome of that test to the genetic signature in 14 different SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. So
That's on the DNA, is it, the SNPs?
that's on the DNA, yes. And to do this, a very elaborate artificial intelligence machine learning approach was utilized. So instead of having this complex test, we now have a genetic test consisting of 14 different SNPs, and depending on what these SNPs look like, individuals can be classed as non-suppressors or suppressors. If you are non-suppressor, you would be a candidate for the vasopressin drug. So instead of doing this practically not useful challenge test, we now can draw a simple blood test and get the results back with the classification of the patient. But it's important to mention that the genes don't change from one week to the other. So, but depression can go away. So the test identifies individuals who, when they are depressed, have this tendency to a malfunction in the HPA axis and in the vasopressin system.
Wow, I think I kept up with most of that. Thank you, Hans. That's
Yes.
really interesting. And ultimately, the blood test you're talking about, you said initially it's a couple of days, multiple blood tests. Are we saying that's what every patient needs in order to determine whether they're non-suppressors or suppressors? Will they each have to go through that kind of prolonged, blood
No,
test over multiple
no.
days?
So this complex test, we hope to be able to pass by with a shortcut that the blood test gives us. So what will happen now, both in our clinical trials and hopefully in the future, if the drug shows efficacy and good tolerability, that the clinician will be able to draw a blood test from a depressed patient, send it to a lab, and then get the results back. And the result will say either this patient is very likely to have a strong response to this new intervention, or maybe you shouldn't even try it. And I think this is the threshold of precision psychiatry, where we can direct treatments to specific patients, not just give everyone an SSRI, and the ones who don't respond get something else, and then you go to some third category where you make some other change to the treatment.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what we're talking about with precision psychiatry.
Yes.
Understanding what makes our patients different and unique. And so thanks for clarifying that. So the multi-day blood test, that was kind of to get the map, to understand the relationships, the correlations, and once hopefully you've kind of proven all that data out, then that kind of single point of care blood test will hopefully be sufficient to determine which category the patient fits into.
Yes.
And I wonder how much of the patients that are treatment resistant, how much of that treatment resistance will be described by this blood test?
We don't know that yet. I think that treatment resistance is probably not a biological property in itself. It's the result of having tried different types of biological interventions. But let's say we had access to these types of tests for all the commonly used antidepressants, the SSRIs, the SNRIs, bupropion, mirtazapine, all the commonly used drugs. Maybe we would end up with far fewer treatment-resistant patients, because they would get a treatment earlier on where they have a higher likelihood of getting an adequate response.
Yeah, and I've worked in inpatient psychiatry where a lot of very depressed, suicidal patients come in, and it takes many, many weeks to try the first antidepressant to see the response, and then if it doesn't work, you then have to keep them inpatient for more weeks. So it would really keep people hopefully outpatient more and need less kind of trials, and it's kind of almost guesswork right now with what medications are going to work. Quick question about the genetic test, and have you done any other studies that use EEG or fMRI? Do you sense that there could be some kind of synchronicity with using those as well as the blood test?
We are currently not using other modalities than genetic testing, but our approach is suitable for using other types of data findings. We can essentially work with any type of data that can be taken from the patient, biological, it could be neuroimaging. We even consider the possibility of using more of psychological testing to help to qualify the patients into different categories to find the best treatment for them. And that's, I think, the beauty of our approach, that it opens up to actually explore other compounds in the future as well, because there are quite a lot of compounds that have not reached all the way to patients, have not reached regulatory approvals, in spite of having shown clear signs of efficacy. And if we could only find the patients who respond to those treatments, we might do this exercise time and time and time again. And at the end of the day, we may be sitting with a large number of tests combined with efficacious drugs, where we could really help patients to reach the medicine that works from the get-go, rather than having this slightly unsophisticated journey through testing medicine after medicine without really having a clue.
Yeah, and the ketamine medication that you're working on is called Ketabon, but you've got some other compound, kind of novel chemical entities. Without giving away the secret sauce, what kinds of compounds are we talking about? Are they kind of within that same ketamine family, or they have a totally different molecular structure?
They have a different molecular structure, so they are smaller compounds, and they interact with one of them interacts with the Vasopressin system in the brain, and the other one with the CRH system in the brain. Both of these systems are very deeply involved in the regulation of the stress axis. And for each of these two projects, we have tests that have developed to identify individuals who are more likely to respond to such interventions.
I'm not sure if you've heard of Amanda Fielding
Yeah.
from
Oh yes,
Beckley
I
Psytech.
listened to her a month ago in London.
Oh, you were there live. Wonderful. I just
Yes.
have heard on podcasts, and
Yeah.
recently she was talking about her experiences with that kind of vassal system you were talking about. What's that name
Yeah.
of that system again?
The Vasopressin system.
Yeah, the Vasopressin system. And she has a theory about how that influences of depression and other things. And have you heard about her experiences actually kind of opening up her brain with, I think, trepanation it's called, to
Yes,
kind of
yes,
work with
I've
that?
heard about that.
Yeah.
And
What's just...
I mean, it sounds odd, but at the same time, it's an approach that has been applied over time. So once again, I think one has to be humble and listen to the input. There may be something to that as well.
It's I am a huge fan of Amanda Fielding. She's a legend, and I'm interested that this brain of ours that you said is more complex than the universe. Is we've got the chemical piece to it, we've got the kind of organic, physical matter, we've got the electrical as well, and receptors, and then we've got the blood, that kind of the blood system going through, and how they all work together. And we really just don't know so much about it.
No. I completely agree. I think one area that I expect to be developing quite a lot in coming years is to understand how the brain is affected by things that are ongoing in other parts of our bodies. For instance, things such as peripheral inflammation, does that affect the brain? The composition of the gut microbiome in our guts, what effect does that have on the brain? So I think we are probably moving into an era where we see the brain not only as an isolated world swimming around in the cerebrospinal fluid, protected by the blood-brain barrier, but actually as sort of more of a dynamic partner in our bodies.
Yeah, fascinating. And I also wanted to get a bit of free education from you, Hans, around artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I have a sense of what they mean, but how does that apply to your work, particularly around the genetic markers that your compounds are facing?
Yeah. So one could say that if you look at genes that seem to have some sort of predictive value for depression, for other psychiatric disorders, in general, the field has been quite disappointed because even the genes that are most implicated in having relevance, they at most contribute to some percent of the variance. So therefore, other methods need to be used. So what we are doing here is that we are in the case of the test I spoke about previously, where we were mapping from the outcome of the physiological challenge test to the SNP, to the 14 SNPs we identified in the genetic test. That step uses machine learning and artificial intelligence to essentially, it's all about using this technology to take the patients who were non-suppressors, find characteristics of their genome that they have in common that would be able to pull together as a test. So it's a step that you can, to different degrees, guide what is happening, but it's also a process that to quite some extent runs in the computer systems that we are using and ends up with delivering these in our case these SNPs and the interpretation of the SNPs. So it's very sophisticated. I'm not a computational scientist. We have strong people on board. We've just onboarded a very famous specialist on psychiatric genetics. So we have a team that is working on setting these processes up.
Hmm. Wonderful. And speaking about AI, just reading a story today about Lambda. If you
Yeah.
Google's kind of AI machine learning language model, that it had to be turned off because it was too sentient. That it was,
Yes.
and they show the transcript of the conversation between this, I guess, a computer program and a developer at Google, and it seems to have this sentient sense of self and ability to, converse and believe that it is a being.
It's a bit scary.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. I'm bloody petrified, to be honest. What
Yeah.
I know you're not doing that on your end, but yeah, what's your sense around limits on AI, machine learning? How are we going to negotiate this over the next years, decades?
Yeah. I mean, I'm less worried about us creating computers that believe that they have an ego, because I still think that we will be the ones who can control the computers. I think they carry lots of promise in finding things you haven't really been looking for. Um, I mean, for instance, if you develop a drug for something, you typically characterize its receptor binding profile. So if we were to develop a new psychedelic compound, which has most of its efficacy on the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, we would also like to be able to find to what extent it binds to other receptors, and that's a standard procedure in the industry. So you test it against a broad panel of known receptors, and you get values for the affinity for these receptors. But you only get the values for the receptors you ask to test it for. So you're only finding things that you're looking for. So I think machine learning opens up to finding the unexpected, not only hypothesis-driven searches, but also coming out with something that you really didn't know that you were looking for.
That's a really good way of explaining it. Thank you. Yeah, because we often set up those hypotheses and it kind of limits what we can
Yes,
find because what we're
yes,
looking for.
yes.
Wonderful. Oh, okay, so I think we're almost at time, Hans. I just wanted to note that HMNC is a private company, so you haven't gone
Yes.
public. That's
No.
quite an achievement. How have you done it? And yeah, any plans that have been announced around the company?
Yeah, so it is a privately held company. We have strong investors which are very dedicated. So we feel that we are in a firm spot in that respect. And of course, right now we are gearing up our activities. We are uh, just now starting to include the first patients in our phase 2 study for our ketamine formulation. And later this year or early next year, we're going to start the phase 2 study for this vasopressin inhibitor. So we're, of course, moving into a phase where we will probably need more people on board, where we also could anticipate higher costs. So we are, of course, certainly in a phase where we are very interested and open to discussions with investors, and we are continuously in such discussions.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so I'd love you to tell our audience how they can find you, the company, and any other pieces of information we didn't quite get to today.
Okay, so the company is at www.hmnc-brainhealth.com. So that's the easiest way to get hold of us. And if there are questions that people would like to ask, they can be submitted to our website. That's the easiest way.
Got it. Wonderful. Okay, anything else you want to leave our audience with around what you're working on?
I, I'd like to say that I actually think that we are quite fortunate now because we are at the threshold of the second major revolution in neuroscience. The first one occurred during the 50s when all the drugs that we are using today essentially were born. When the antidepressants came to life, when the antipsychotics were discovered, when the anxiolytics were discovered, and that after that, not really. There's not so much that has happened since then during these 70 years. But now all of a sudden things really take off. And I think the next 5 to 10 years will be extremely exciting. So it's a privilege to be part of this journey.
Yeah, it really feels that way. Wonderful. Okay, Hans Eriksson, Chief Clinical Development Officer from HMNC Brain Health. Lovely chatting with you. And yeah, keep us updated on how the clinical trials go. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.